Jack stood in the dimly lit kitchen, holding a can of his favorite Indian pale ale. The weight of a long workday still clung to him. The room was quiet, with only the sound of the refrigerator door opening and closing. In the stillness of the night, he glanced out the kitchen window. The soft glow of the garden lights reflected off the pool's surface. There, in the faint light, sat Emily, his wife, curled up on the outdoor couch. She was looking at her phone, absent-mindedly twirling a strand of blonde hair between her fingers, a familiar gesture Jack had always loved. Her long silky hair had always been something he admired, and every time she did this, it had made him feel a deep connection. But tonight, something felt different. Jack watched closely, sensing an unusual energy in her demeanor. Emily's expression was bright, her smile wide and her eyes sparkling. It reminded him of the way she looked at him when they were newlyweds. But this time, that joy wasn't for him. She was speaking to someone, her voice carrying a quiet enthusiasm he hadn't heard in a long time. At first, Jack reasoned it could be a friend or a business colleague. But then, something inside him shifted. His chest tightened as realization crept in. Emily wasn't just laughing. She was deeply engaged in a conversation with someone important, someone she didn't want him to know about. Jack stood frozen, unable to look away. Every movement, the way she twirled her hair, the way she lit up with every response felt like a silent revelation. It was a contrast to the distance he had felt growing between them for months. Her laughter filled the air, but it was different from the laughter they had once shared. For a long moment, Jack couldn't breathe. He had sensed this change for a while, but now, it felt undeniable. He turned away from the window, walked into the living room, and switched on the TV. The baseball game played on the screen, but he couldn't focus. His mind was consumed by one thought. When had her heart changed? A while later, Emily came inside, her face still glowing as if nothing had happened. She sat beside him and asked, "Are you done with work? Why didn't you come outside with me?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stared at her, sensing an invisible distance between them. Emily studied his face, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "I was just talking to Steve about a big project," she added when he didn't respond. Jack only nodded, turning his gaze back to the screen. "Didn't you hear me?" she pressed, her voice slightly tense. "No, I didn't hear you," Jack replied, his tone flat. Emily hesitated, then got up to pour herself a glass of wine before settling back on the couch. They sat in silence, as if nothing had changed. But inside Jack, everything had. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of Emily's radiant face as she spoke to someone else. He had heard her promises before that no one would ever come between them, but now, he wondered if she even remembered those words. The next morning, Jack woke up early and tried to carry on as usual, but his mind was elsewhere. His phone buzzed with a notification from the tracking software he had installed on Emily's phone. He had wrestled with guilt about it, but now, the confirmation weighed heavier than he expected. Every call, every message, every location update filled his screen. And then, one notification stood out. Emily wasn't at the office. She was somewhere else. A quiet area, far from their usual places. Jack felt his pulse quicken. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers. A few days later, after returning from a business trip, Jack decided it was time to take action. But first, he needed undeniable proof. He hired a private investigator to uncover the full truth. Within a week, the investigator provided him with photos and reports, evidence that confirmed his suspicions. The reality stung, but instead of reacting impulsively, Jack steeled himself. He needed to be strategic. Instead of confronting Emily immediately, he made preparations. He contacted a lawyer and gathered all necessary documents. He informed his children about the decision he had made. It was painful, but he knew it was the only way forward. Jack also packed Emily's belongings into boxers, everything from sentimental gifts to valuable items. Each box felt like a chapter closing, a step toward reclaiming himself. On the morning of his planned departure, Jack took a deep breath and set everything in motion. He left the documents on the table, along with the evidence he had gathered. Then, he walked out of the house without looking back. As he drove away, a weight lifted from his chest. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer trapped in the illusion of a love that had faded. He was finally free to start anew. Jack packed Emily's belongings neatly, but he knew that once they were thrown outside, nothing would remain intact. Before leaving, Jack received a message from the private investigator. The message made him even more determined. Melly and Steve had met privately the previous evening at a fancy restaurant downtown. Jack could clearly hear the name of the restaurant and its address, which only confirmed that their relationship was more than just professional. The night before, it was David who had driven Emily home. An hour later, Jack arrived at Steve's house, the place where he planned to leave Emily's belongings. He parked the truck on the wide road in front of Steve's house. Stepping out, his heart pounded, knowing that everything had been set into motion. One by one, He pulled out the boxers and placed them forcefully on the driveway. Meanwhile, Emily and Steve were inside, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Emily was lounging in the garden, chatting on the phone with friends, oblivious to what was coming. Jack watched from a distance as each of Emily's possessions lay scattered on the concrete. He didn't feel joy, only a strange emptiness. But that feeling lasted just a moment, because as soon as Emily and Steve stepped outside, he knew this was the decisive moment. Emily's eyes fell on the pile of her belongings. She immediately realized what was happening. "What's going on?" she cried, running toward the pile, panic evident in her voice. Steve, standing beside her, furrowed his brow, trying to grasp the situation. Then, he saw Jack standing there, arms crossed, his gaze cold. Fear surged inside Emily. She turned to Steve, her face pale. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack remained silent for a moment before walking to the truck. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of documents, divorce papers. "The end of everything. Emily," Jack said, his voice steady. "You know exactly what you've done. And now, we're done." Each word hit Emily like a wave. She couldn't believe her choices had led to this. Steve shifted uncomfortably beside her, realizing the weight of the situation. Jack turned to him and said, "You and your company will have to take responsibility." Jack glanced one last time at the belongings on the ground. The feeling inside him wasn't victory, but release. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. Without another word, he got into his truck and drove away. A heavy silence filled the air. Emily and Steve stood frozen, unable to grasp the full impact of what had just happened. Emily looked around in disbelief. Each of her possessions was now scattered, a reminder of what had been lost. "I don't understand," Emily murmured, her voice weak. Steve remained silent, his gaze fixed on the truck that had just disappeared. A deep sense of regret filled him. He had not only betrayed Jack, but also compromised his professional relationships. "There must be some misunderstanding," Steve said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Will you help me, Steve? I can't let everything end like this." Steve hesitated, looking back at the house, which now felt cold and unwelcome. Both of them knew that nothing could be undone. An hour later, as Emily sat numbly on the doorstep, Steve received a call. On the other end was a voice filled with quiet determination. It was Jack. "Steve," Jack said, "I warned you. You and your company won't get away with this easily. There will be consequences." Steve remained silent, but he knew there was no escaping the fallout. Everything was beginning to unravel. That evening, Emily returned to her house, but everything felt different. The walls, the furniture, the memories, they all felt foreign. She picked up her phone and tried calling Jack, but his phone was off. Anxiety grew inside her. She felt as if she were being pushed toward the edge. She had told herself over and over that her relationship with Steve was just work-related, but now she had to face the truth. She had crossed a line. And Jack wasn't just ending the marriage. He was prepared for a difficult legal battle. One of Jack's most difficult decisions was informing their children. He knew it would be a painful conversation, but he couldn't keep the truth from them. That afternoon, he called them. "Kids, I have something important to tell you," Jack said over the phone. "Your mother and I are separating. This isn't something I wanted, but sometimes we have to face the truth." Jack's children were silent, struggling to process the news. They had never imagined their family would fall apart. "We'll get through this together," Jack reassured them. "I'll always be here for you." But he knew that no matter what, their lives had changed forever. Emily turned to Steve, hoping for reassurance. But all she found was silence. Steve had withdrawn, no longer offering comfort or support. Emily realized she had lost not just Jack, but everything that had once meant respect and the love she had taken for granted. Jack didn't just want to end things, he wanted Emily to understand that every action had consequences, but he also knew that nothing could change the past. His focus now was on the future where he could finally find peace. That evening, Emily stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing her own reflection. The confident woman she once was had been replaced by someone weighed down by regret. Memories of her early days with Jack flooded back, the laughter, the late-night talks, the trips, all of it was now just a distant memory. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. While Emily was lost in her thoughts, Jack was preparing for the next chapter of his life. He met with his lawyer, reviewing documents and planning the next steps. "Are you sure about this?" the lawyer asked. "This won't be easy. It will affect not just Emily, but your children as well." Jack took a deep breath. "I can't live in a dishonest marriage. I want to move forward with my life." The lawyer nodded. "Then, let's proceed." The next day, Emily received a call from Jack. Her heart raced. "We need to talk." Jack's voice was cold. "Meet me at the park at 5 p.m. Emily felt a wave of emotions hit her. She knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. At 5 p.m., she arrived at the park, finding Jack standing beneath an old oak tree. the same spot where they had shared so many happy memories. But now, those moments felt like a lifetime ago. She approached, her eyes red from crying.